I spoke about the situation on the ground in Mariupol earlier today with Ken Roth, the executive director of Human Rights Watch. They've been reporting on the siege of the city and how Russian forces have been fighting this war. Ken Roth, thanks so much for joining me on the show this evening. Human Rights Watch covers a lot of conflicts around the world. Put Ukraine in perspective for our viewers. How bad are the abuses and atrocities that are coming out of that conflict that your group is monitoring and documenting right now?
Well, Mehdi, let me make clear, I think we're worried about where this could go foremost. The Russian military has a history, when faced with significant military resistance, of using scorched earth tactics, of just indiscriminately destroying cities. That's what they did in Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. That's what they did in eastern Aleppo in Syria. And we worry about that's what they might do in Kiev or Kharkiv in Ukraine. Now, that hasn't happened yet. What we're seeing so far is indiscriminate shelling, the use of indiscriminate cluster munitions, and the besieging of cities. You know, all of this was characteristic of the conflict in Syria. It's at early stages, and so it could get a lot worse. Frankly, we're trying to document what's going on with the aim of preventing it from getting much worse.
Sadly, in such situations, it can always get worse. Human Rights Watch said today that Ukrainian civilians in Mariupol are being denied access to running water, electricity, or heat since March the 2nd and being besieged by Russian forces on all sides. That sounds like a war crime. Should it be investigated as one?
Oh, absolutely. And if I could just add to that list for a moment, they're being bombarded at the same time. So, you know, here it is, you know, temperatures hovering around freezing. They've been going now almost a week with no electricity, no heat, no running water, no sewage, no communication. They are completely cut off. People are, you know, desperately trying to, you know, melt snow to drink, you know, trying to find food wherever they can. Now, there's an absolute duty in a situation like this to allow civilians to evacuate and to let humanitarian aid in for the civilians who remain. And there have been a series of supposed agreements to let that happen. Each time they've broken down, you know, allegedly with the Russian troops shelling the evacuation corridor or the proposed humanitarian convoy. Now, the one thing the Russians are saying is, you know, you can go to Russia, you can go to Belarus, but, you know, that isn't the way it works. People who are fleeing a catastrophe like Mariupol should be able to flee to where they want, which in this case is, you know, Western Ukraine or on into the European Union. They should not be forced into the territory of the occupier, which in essence is what the Russian troops are.
Ken, on that note, if I can jump in, what hope do you have that humanitarian corridors protected by limited ceasefires, quote unquote, on the ground can be set up, can be sustained to get civilians out? What obligations do parties to a conflict like this have to guarantee such corridors under international law?
Under the Geneva Conventions, under international humanitarian law, they have an absolute duty to allow civilians to evacuate a bombarded and besieged city like Mariupol, and to let humanitarian aid in to deal with, you know, to sustain the civilians who remain. Now, what we saw in Syria is these kind of siege tactics would go on for months. The Russians and their Syrian allies would use basically the starvation of civilians to weaken armed rebel forces. Ultimately, though, they would let people flee, because they recognized that it was in their interest to, you know, just take over the city without a large population there. I hope it doesn't take that long in Mariupol. And of course, it's not going to be easy for Russian forces to take the city anyhow, because Ukrainian troops are putting up quite stiff resistance. But the civilians should not be pawns in this conflict. They should be permitted to flee if that's what they want to do. If they want to stay home, they should have access to humanitarian aid.
Ken, there's been condemnation of Russia for using, or allegedly using, cluster munitions, which Moscow denies it's doing. There's also been talk of dragging Vladimir Putin. There's been talk of dragging Vladimir Putin before the International Criminal Court, the ICC. Of course, Russia is neither a signatory to the 2008 convention banning cluster bombs or the Rome Statute, which set up the ICC. But neither are we, neither is the United States. Do you hope that this conflict could lead to the US maybe, finally, taking its own international obligations more seriously, signing up to these international treaties so we have more credibility when we rightly condemn Russia?
Well, first, let me make clear, Mehdi, that Russian troops are using cluster munitions. Human Rights Watch has documented that. They're also engaging in other forms of indiscriminate warfare. the fact that neither Russia nor Ukraine has ratified the treaty banning cluster munitions still means that they are prohibited because the broader Geneva Conventions outlaw indiscriminate warfare. So these are clear war crimes. They shouldn't be happening. Yes, the U.S. government would be in a stronger position to protest. The U.S. ambassador to the UN just yesterday said that cluster munitions should never be used in this context, and they actually had to erase the transcript afterwards because that's not the Pentagon's position. Now, when it comes to the International Criminal Court, it does have jurisdiction because Ukraine has given it that jurisdiction. That means that any war crime committed on Ukrainian territory, even by Russian troops, can be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court prosecutor. Now, ironically, the U.S. government seems to be encouraging that, but the official Washington position is that nobody can ever be prosecuted on another country's territory, even if that other country has ratified the International Criminal Court Treaty, if the offending, the warring party, the war criminal, if his country has not ratified that treaty. So because the U.S. has never ratified it, they say no American troop in, say, Afghanistan should be able to be prosecuted for torture they might have committed there. Now, that's completely at odds with what is going on in Ukraine, where the U.S. seems to be encouraging prosecution of Russian soldiers by the International Criminal Court, even though Russia hasn't prosecuted. It hasn't ratified. I hope that the hypocrisy of that situation leads the U.S. government to change its assessment of the International Criminal Court's powers.
For me, the self-defeating inconsistency here is so frustrating. And on that note, one last question for you. There has been a lot of attention in the West and in Western media on Human Rights Watch's reporting on alleged Russian atrocities in Ukraine, including this latest statement of yours on Mariupol that we've covered tonight. A lot of the time, though, Ken, when you're reporting on, say, Israeli human rights abuses, you get a lot of pushback from Western governments, from the U.S. Congress, from Western media, too. Is there an inconsistency in how well your report are received or even believed, depending on which countries they're targeting?
Of course. I mean, there are times when governments love our reports because we are documenting the crimes of their adversaries. But when we're documenting the crimes of their friends, they're less receptive. The point we try to make over and over again is that we are applying, the exact same standards, using the exact same fact-finding methodology in all of these circumstances. And that, we don't change. It's the international community's reaction that changes. And clearly, the best way to promote human rights is to promote them consistently, not to have an exception for Israel or for Egypt or Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, which the U.S. government tends to have.
Ken Roth, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you for your time tonight, and thank you for your organization's work.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mehdi Hasan. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more of The Mehdi Hasan Show by clicking on any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thank you for watching.